They invite the blue-haired girl to take the microphone because they're confident that they can destroy her. But they're rather less interested in taking on intelligent criticism to their right. There's only so long that they're going to be able to get away with that.
That is why anarcho-tyranny is happening. They are tolerating atrocities committed by non-indigenous immigrant populations who are disproportionately more likely to commit violent crime, especially against whites who they have an ethnic grudge against, and demanding that we don't notice these differences, and when we do notice them, we fall afoul of unilateral hate speech legislation. The Prevent figures released in the last week, and now the far right are now, in overall terms, the greatest threat. They don't talk about per capita, of course, because far right, in common parlance, just means English people who refuse to have their identity liquidated by liberal multiculturalism. You pointed out, was Enoch Powell right to suggest that we remedy this demographic and cultural catastrophe in the early stages rather than not just allow it to metastasize, but pour even more kindling on the burning bonfire? And he said, no, because it would be uncivilized. And it's like, okay, would it be uncivilized if the English became a minority in their own country and we turned into Lebanon or Lahore or South Africa or any of the other third world backwaters that you find to be barbarous and reprehensible?
Hello and welcome to Deprogrammed. This is the NCF show where we do our best to fight back against ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I am a fellow at the New Culture Forum, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by my trusty co-host and one of the leading contributors at Courage Media, Connor Tomlinson. We were due, Connor, as you know, to be joined by Dr. David Starkey, but events got in the way, so Connor and I are going to have to do our utmost to endure each other's company for 30 minutes, 35 minutes or so.
I'm sure we can manage, though the alternative was, of course, asking Dr. Starkey one question and filling an hour's worth of content.
That's why I didn't really prepare very much.
He is an inexhaustible well of knowledge, but today ours is dry.
Yes, and so we're going to have to do our best to keep people interested, and I suppose there's no shortage of things to talk about. So let's begin with the fact that there is a heightened sense in Britain at the moment that we are no longer as safe a country as we used to be. Barely a week passes when we do not see some unprovoked attack, typically by some member of an immigrant population, whether first generation, second generation, even third generation at times. Wayne Broadhurst stabbed by an Afghan in Uxbridge, 10 people stabbed on a train in Huntington by an African, and recently a woman named Katie Fox tragically stabbed in the neck, murdered in Birmingham, again by a man who appears to have been of second generation African descent.
There was another woman also murdered in Albury, I think it was, near Birmingham, by a man, Mohammed Azim, who may or may not be a 3-time offender of the same name, where he served, a 16-year prison sentence for manslaughter, and then seems to have been let out early, and then was convicted for an 11-year prison sentence for 3 counts of sexual violence.
Yes.
About 2013, and then for some reason, good behaviour for this multiple-time murderer and sexual offender has then been allowed out onto the streets and then kill another woman in a completely unprovoked attack.
I think this British state is actually somewhat benefiting from how scattershot all of these episodes are, because if it was just one, like when the sort of Jamie Bolger thing happened in the 1990s, because it was such a rarity, it occupied public attention for about 6 months. And many of these cases would have done the same thing in the 90s, but because they're so regular today, barely has one had enough time to take stock of the most recent one that a new one has happened, and we do actually overall become desensitized to it. So maybe our elites do somewhat benefit from how much collateral damage their incompetence is causing us. But suffice it to say that the British state isn't only failing to keep us safe, its most fundamental duty in a whole set of different ways, but is also hostile, and has been hostile now for about 50 years or so, to the rights of Englishmen, and particularly English women, who have no other way of defending themselves against attackers to defend themselves, not least by having things like pepper spray. In the United States, they even have sort of conceal and carry laws for women who may fear rape. How would you go about explaining, we can talk about it a little bit, what we might call England's descent, Britain's descent from what used to be celebrated, ordered freedom, to its insidious polar opposite, anarcho-tyranny?
So the reason why the state refuses to draw qualitative distinctions between the types of people who are more or less likely to commit crimes And usually this falls along ethnic lines, not just cultural lines, because for whatever reason, black individuals in the UK have a 9 to 10 times more likelihood of being diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder like schizophrenia. Think Valdo Calacane, who killed 2 students and a caretaker in 2023, I believe it was, in Nottingham.
Yes.
And then the state mobilized the Don't Look Back in Anger sideshow, thinking it was an Islamic terror attack when it just turned out to be an African schizo. So whether or not this is cultural because of high rates of drug use, whether or not it's genetic and it's been triggered by high rates of drug use, suffice to say, there are clear distinctions in who is more likely to be psychotic and who is more likely to commit the kinds of attacks that we saw in Huntington. But the state refuses to draw qualitative distinctions, as Shabana Mahmood did in the aftermath of Huntington, saying that Anthony Williams, the attempted mass stabber, who also seems to have stabbed a 14-year-old boy, also seems to have attacked someone on a train before, is just as British as you and me. It's a British man. Don't ask any more questions.
Rest assured, he has the requisite paperwork. Therefore, you have nothing to complain about, even though we gave him the paperwork.
Yeah, he didn't discard his passport at the bottom of the English Channel like all of the other
so it's fine.
Dinghy crossers. There's a veritable coral reef down there at the moment. Bear in mind, it's just because he was, born here and didn't have the opportunity to actually break into the country in the first place. We don't have to ask any questions because he has had his passport stamped. And as we know, administrative decisions overrule thousands of years of family formation, culture, custom, etc. from halfway around the world in a completely different environment. The reason they refuse to draw this distinction is, as we've discussed before, because in the post-war moral order, racism is the greatest sin you can ever commit, because the atrocities of the Second World War, exclusively on the Axis side, we don't talk about, of course, the mass murder of not just millions of Europeans, but also Jews by Stalin in the Holodomor, in the Gulag system, the way the Red Army rampaged across Axis
Germany.
Axis Europe. We don't talk about that. We can only talk about the Nazi atrocities, and those Nazi atrocities were committed in a racist way against Jews, but also black people, gay people, gypsies, the disabled, all of the intersectional checklist groups. And so the worst thing you can be in this moral order is racist, which means if you notice distinctions between cultures, peoples, histories, heritages, and nations, you are indistinguishable from Adolf Hitler. And so the only legitimate position in the ruling moral order, including applied to borders, is the supposition of the blank slate. That deep down, all economic, cultural, and educational and geographic differences are just the consequence of arbitrary or unjust oppression, and the state that recognizes we're all the same underneath, we have an egalitarian nature that we fell from out of some kind of secular Eden. One state that recognizes that truth can easily remedy this with more social housing, more welfare, more classes on women's consent, and just by bringing them here through the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, or being born on British soil, thereby making them as British as you and me. And it's actually our fault, as the ignorant far-right racists that we are, that enact a kind of Schrodinger's diversity principle where just by observing the differences, we bring them into being. So if we just ignored them and let the procedures of the liberal state run its course, there would be no more crime. We'd be as British as you and me. And if people doubt that they actually believe this, go and read Zoe Williams' Guardian column in the aftermath of the Epping Hotel protests. Today, it was just ruled, by the way, that Epping Hotel still has to house these asylum seeker sex offenders, which you put in Restore Britain, that case about the Sikh chap.
Yes.
The reason that they don't even take into account the criminal activities of these men is because under Article 3, it should be immaterial because Article 3 is absolute.
This was a Strasbourg interpretation, 1996, in the Chahal versus United Kingdom case. People can read about it. But it basically meant that someone's right to human right to be spared maltreatment, either in their own country of origin or in a third country, was absolute enough in its application that there could be no possible public safety countervailing concerns. And so I think the judgment says something along the lines of, no matter how monstrous the actions of the defendant, it would remain a breach of his Article 3 rights to send him back to wherever it was.
Yes, and these laws were written in the aftermath of the Second World War on the presumption that there could be one international, neutral, universal body of law to govern all nations, and was especially necessary because in the First World War you couldn't trust nations to prosecute their own war criminals, so you needed an independent judiciary to sit above that, governing all people in a universal fashion.
Yeah.
So the reason I bring that up is because international law has just ruled that those men need to stay in Epping. In the aftermath of the protests, Zoe Williams wrote in The Guardian that, well, don't you really feel for people like the Ethiopian sex offender Hadush Kabatu in question, who was not named at the time, because put yourself in their position. If you had fled poverty and war, come into a country, and every day you had people protesting outside your hotel room saying, you aren't wanted here. Bear in mind that only happened after he tried to sexually assault a schoolgirl after being in the country for 8 days. Well, then wouldn't you struggle to fit into? Translation. These migrants are only sex offenders because we notice the differences between us and them. If we just pretended they were as British as you and me, there would be no crime.
Yes.
And so that is why anarcho-tyranny is happening. They are tolerating atrocities committed by non-indigenous immigrant populations who are disproportionately more likely to commit violent crime, especially against whites who they have an ethnic grudge against, and demanding that we don't notice these differences, and when we do notice them, we fall afoul of unilateral hate speech legislation, which has come from things like the Macpherson Report, the College of Policing, the Public Order Act, etc. This Justinian library of laws that trip us up for complaining about it, but allow violent criminals out of prison early or just to walk the streets without ever being prosecuted.
It's an additional aspect of the schizophrenia as well, that on the one hand, they do say that diversity is our strength, but on the other hand, they are constantly pressing the need for this battery of legal reinforcements to make it work in practice. It can't be a very splendid tapestry if it requires constant ultra-draconian maintenance, and yet their own activities show that they implicitly concede that that's exactly what it needs. And we live in a hellish dystopia anyway, so it doesn't even really bring the dream into full fruition. It's not only a Guardian columnist as well, like Zoe Williams, as I don't need to tell you. We're also thinking here about people like Rishi Sunak. This is just something that comes to mind. I remember when George Galloway won a by-election in, I forget, what was it, 2023 or something, and there was this great big...
Rotherham or Rochdale?
One of those quintessentially English cities. And Rishi Sunak made a speech in front of Parliament in which he put the threat of imported Islamic extremism on the same footing as people who oppose it. It's exactly what you're saying here about Schrödinger's diversity principle. There's this sort of ham-handed pursuit of even-handedness, this desire to say that yes, it may be true that there are certain anti-liberal philosophies like Islamism that may accidentally be of foreign extraction, but the people who don't think that we can reprogram those people, namely sensible, law-abiding members of the host population who have long protested this experiment and never wanted to go down this avenue in the first place, are all of a sudden put on exactly the same footing as the people who've been imported. And so I think Rishi Sunak says something along the lines of both the extremes of the far right and the extremes of Islamists who pose a joint symbiotic threat to the multicultural democracy that we are working to build together.
So that happened at the same time as Michael Gove getting up at the dispatch box and saying that Britain is a thriving, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. Correct. And diversity is our strength. And that was announcing the anti-extremism definition that was co-authored by Dame Sarah Khan, whose sister runs Raiku, who recently wrote a report on threats to democracy with Hope Not Hate. So they're literally allying with the open borders communists to push this position of themselves as the umpires between irreconcilable community groups. And they inflict one tribalistic diaspora onto the native host population against their wishes, and then pretend that the complaints of the native population are on equal moral footing to violent attacks by the imported peoples who never needed to be here.
Yes.
And on the point of the threat of the phantom far right, we just had the Prevent figures released in the last week, and now the far right are now, in overall terms, the greatest threat. They don't talk about per capita, of course, because far right, in common parlance, just means English people who refuse to have their identity liquidated by liberal multiculturalism. But also, according to the Home Office, it means readers of Douglas Murray, Beowulf, Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis, George Orwell's 1984, and those who watch Michael Portillo's Great British Railway Journeys. Whereas Islam has been consistently decreased in priority ever since the 2017 Manchester Arena bombings, even though it remains the overall perpetrator of violent, lethal terror attacks. The overall number of terrorists in prison, the overall number of terror suspects on MI5's watch list.
People on the watch list, yeah.
Yeah, and we're still getting consistent trials for thwarted terror plots, as well as one that just happened in early October by a man literally named Holy Warrior from Syria. His name was Jihad. Like, the warning signs were there. Meanwhile, if you're Sam Melia and you put up a few offensive stickers about Jewish people or immigrants, then you are treated as exactly the same.
And to speak of Sam Melia, 80% of the stickers he was putting out, there were 20%. 20% of them were about Jewish people. Most of them were just the sort of things that we would say routinely on the New Culture Forum. ONS statistics. We're going to be a minority by 2066. Immigration. They seek conquest, not shelter, or something like that. Like very, very sort of run-of-the-mill centre-right stuff. Most of it aimed at illegal immigration, rather legal immigration. It's absolutely outrageous that he was subjected to that 2-year prison sentence. Although I think he may well be out now. But you're right. And what's very puzzling is that this kind of utopian perfectionist ethos seems to about human nature and what we can do if we try hard enough, and how all sort of tragedies in the world. It's a very anti-tragic, anti-Christian view. All tragedies in the world are in the last analysis attributable to corrigible social arrangements, and if arrangements have been made in this way, they can be unmade in this way and remade in new ways that are sort of more conducive to the sort of heavenly utopia that we want to see. This ethos corrupts both the left and the right, both Zoe Williams and Gove, both Zoe Williams and Rishi Sunak. And I think that this is another very important ideological input into anarcho-tyranny, because once you have that anti-tragic utopian view, crime is not a failing that we can just tie to human nature, incorrigible aspects of human nature. It is a social pathology, or it is proof of a social pathology that can and should be corrected for, because all utopians are social engineers one way or another by self-appointment. That is what a utopian is, I would say. And so when you get someone stabbing someone in the neck, or when you get someone committing a rape, particularly if they enjoy special accredited victim group points by virtue of their membership of some, indigestible minority subculture, tends to be the case, of course, either the police cracking down on that, or the law affording you or me or women in our lives that we care about more freedom to defend themselves against the predations of people like that, comes to be seen as compounding the oppression experienced by the criminal.
It's a provocation.
It's a provocation, but it's also, his criminality is proof that he is beleaguered in some way. And therefore, to go too harsh on him, sure, there might be a case for sequestering him from society and while we try and work things out, but ultimately it's not his fault that he's like that.
He still needs a PlayStation while he's behind bars.
Yeah, he needs a PlayStation when he's up behind bars, and you get these sorts of wacky liberal do-gooder, this understanding of human nature as fundamentally correctable. And I do think that is why all of a sudden the kind of law-abiding ordinary person is actually seen as the threat, because they are the people who are the carriers of those cultural pathologies. The criminal is only proof of them. And so you sort of need to be very permissive when it comes to the criminal, and very draconian when it comes to the people who are most infected by these socially conservative pathologies. So I think that is also a very important input.
Hello, please excuse this brief interruption, but I'd be really grateful if you could please hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our channel. Our mission is vitally important, and we must grow this channel to ensure that our content reaches the biggest possible audience. The best way to do this is for you to subscribe. It's totally free. And in addition to subscribing, if you're able to donate or join our membership scheme, please click on the link in the description or visit our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. We've got great plans ahead, but we can't do it without your support. From only £4 per month, you'll receive a range of perks and benefits, including exclusive content. Thank you.
There's a passage in Hazoni's book, Virtue of Nationalism, and he talks about it in a geopolitical context, but I think we can bring it right down to basically ethnicities. Those that code as white European will have the expectation that they've had a few hundred years on the Enlightenment merry-go-round placed upon them, and so they should know better. They should know that division is only created if you observe the object, and therefore everyone is actually equal. And so the burden is on us to lower our Union Jacks and redefine our identity to a modish set of bland platitudes, British values, as Mr. Gove famously said in 2014, and therefore any flare up of indigestible, violent, tribal disagreeableness by imported minorities is still our fault because we shouldn't retaliate. It's like being back at school when the person who hits first and the person who punches back are held to be equally in contempt because violence is categorically bad. It's like, actually, no, the original position is not that we are all totally equal. Nations come from families. So therefore, ancestry is relevant, culture is relevant, religion is relevant. All of these things form a people. Peoples act differently. The reason countries are the way they are is not because of colonialism or inequality or just the soil. It's because if you get enough people of a certain type in a group, they act a certain way. And that's why they recreate the conditions of their failed homelands in Oz. And so recognizing those differences in the inverse, when you said earlier that the job of a utopian seems to be social engineering, and they believe that crime is something that can be easily remedied by just, twiddling the dials on education and economics, I would actually invert that and say the job of people who notice patterns, recognize differences between peoples, can recognize that every single crime committed by someone who is not ancestrally native to our place is a product of government choice. They are only here because of that delusional utopian ideology of the blank slate. And therefore, if we just got rid of them and didn't let any more in, then yes, we would still have criminals of our own because crime is an eternal human problem, but we would have far fewer crimes of a certain type committed against certain people with a sort of racial, cultural, religious tinge that never need to happen. That's the reason they insist that you can't notice differences between people. And that's why in the final analysis, their ideology doesn't lead to John Lennon's Imagine or Utopia on Earth. It leads to completely preventable atrocities being visited on our women and girls. And I'll just finish quickly. When you said, women in our lives that we care about, this is immediately pressing to me in the last week because one of the most horrific stories I read is there is currently an asylum seeker, fake refugee. I think he's from Egypt. He came over, is staying in the Charing Cross Hotel, was milling about with his co-ethnics in Charing Cross, and a woman walks past and overhears them not speaking English and asks what language they were speaking. He immediately uses a translation app telling her he wants to rape her, abducts her from Charing Cross Station, which is one of the busiest stations in London, and violates her on a rooftop on CCTV, is currently denying that he's done it, even though he's basically been caught red-handed. Mm-hmm. And his lawyer, also an immigrant, because of course, says, well, my client has anxiety and claustrophobia, so he shouldn't be confined, he should be put out on bail.
Yes.
Now, that's the station that my wife frequently goes to. That's the line that I frequently use.
Yes.
Literally none of our family members are safe until we jettison this ridiculous ideology and just get rid of these people.
Amen. And by the way, just a quick footnote on that. If he's seeking asylum from Egypt, he's probably a member of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, like the other guy that raped the girl in Hyde Park, who turns out had spent a 7-year prison sentence in Egypt from 2015 because he was part of a bomb-making squad.
But suffice to say that Mohammed Morsi is not calling the shots in Egypt anymore. You have a sort of secular, anti-Muslim Brotherhood government. So if even if his claim to asylum from Egypt is plausible rather than just a bogus, it is still proof of the fact that he is not going to gel well with life in Britain, as if we didn't need further evidence of that after what you just said. But anyhow, one thing I've noticed as well is that what we might call the institutionally old right, many of the people I'm about to name wouldn't actually want to be classified as right-wing, but they have undue influence, in my view, over the right at the moment. I will give they also buy into this. So, for example, everyone knows now that clip where Konstantin Kisin is speaking to a rape gang's survivor, victim, and as soon as she starts talking about the need for English people to defend themselves, he seems much more alarmed and much more perturbed and much more dissuaded by the suggestion, her gesturing in the direction of a sort of defensive white identity politics than of the problem itself. Increasingly in the West, I would say, more in America, but here too, to some extent, there is quite a clear attempt to discipline what the right can say, what the right can't say. You're allowed to bemoan the consequences of all sorts of policy decisions, but you're not really allowed to engage in sort of organized, concerted executive action to try and prevent this, still less to reverse it, because that would be fascist. So there was this sort of chronic, it seems that the fear of the potential of experimenting with potential remedies is much more overpowering to people like Konstantin Kisin, to people like Michael Gove, to all sorts of other people who could be named on the center right, as it were. The fear of experimenting with potential remedies is much greater than the fear of the condition in which England finds itself, or indeed the West more broadly.
The worst culprit for this is, of course, Fraser Nelson, who, anytime a migrant crime happens, he is keen to, like a poo in front of Homer Simpson, dive before the bullet with a graph, saying, well, actually, overall crime's going down. Pay no attention to the fact there's a rape reported every hour in London, that 50% of those are committed by men of foreign nationality. So that's not even going into ethnicity, because, of course, Anthony Williams, British as you and me because he has the paperwork. So that means that the majority, I would wager, of rapes in London never needed to be committed. But instead, because overall crime is going down via a survey that requires people to report crimes in order for them to be registered, and we know that overall reporting is going down, some crimes, like property crime and the like, are decreasing, but things like phone thefts, rapes, and knife crime, particularly lethal stabbings in London, are going up. Then he can just point to this graph and say, well, don't worry, things are infinitely getting better while Rome burns around you, essentially. And what I find conspicuous is, as you said, there's been this sort of civil war going on for the future of MAGA over in America. There is the conversation about what gets platformed, who is allowed within the tent, who is allowed to discuss certain issues and not. And I find it very conspicuous that so-called right-wing media outlets that position themselves as dissident will immediately run to Fraser Nelson to fabricate excuses for why, Muhammad has just stabbed this girl in the neck in Birmingham or whatever. But they won't talk about the taboo issues at North London dinner parties, like identity, largely legal migration, and how that compounds, and our generational pessimism about integration. Because as you've said before,
generational, the Zoomer generation, in other words.
Yeah, because we've grown up since 1997 and haven't known a world different than having our nose rubbed in diversity by Blair. Mm-hmm. And so, we went to school with these realities, and they were more benign for most of us, but for many they weren't. I mean, I know kids that went to prison for drugs. I know kids that got killed because they got in fights with drug dealers, and that's only gotten worse. And that wasn't exactly a hard up area. I wasn't exactly going to school in Peckham, and this has only gotten worse because of demographic realities. We've seen that with social attitudes among second generation British born Muslims since October the 7th. We've the as you said before, the cause for pessimism comes from the fact that we are not speaking hypothetically about whether or not these things might happen. We're not at the start of a reckless demographic experiment. We're in the midst of one, and it's going very, very badly. And so it's extra insulting when the likes of The Spectator bury a discussion that I have with Michael Gove and refuse to publish the footage, despite people repeatedly asking them to do so. But Unheard, which shares the same parent company as The Spectator, wheel out Fraser Nelson to say, look at my graph, pay no attention to Wayne Broadhurst lying dead in the street.
That footage wasn't misplaced. They managed to dig that one out.
Yeah. That one.
No editing trouble. No tech problems.
No. Weird that one.
Interesting. Yeah, so that's exactly right. And I do think that certain people. So I don't want to be too critical, but Matt Goodwin was on Question Time the other day, and he you're up against a hand-picked BBC audience. You're up against a complete barrage of insufferable psychotic leftism on the panel, likely even from Tories that are going to be present there, not always, but often from Tories as well, certainly from Labour, Green, whoever else might be on there, and Fiona Bruce interjecting whenever you try and make a basic point. And he did pretty well. But at one point, he quite powerfully said, I think it was Lisa Nandy he was next to, he said, what are you going to say to the woman in this place? What are you going to say to the family of this? And he just gave off a very comprehensive, well-rehearsed list of casualties of diversity and multiculturalism, not stretching back 20 years, but I think in this case stretching back like 3 months or something. And it was still a pretty comprehensive list. And then later, one of these sorts of midwit white knight types in the audience with noodle arms said something about, oh, what are you going to say, Matt Goodwin, to the member of the Sikh the Sikh family of the woman who was apparently, allegedly, I don't know whether it's gone to court yet, but allegedly raped by some pretty nasty white people who seemed to tie their rape, according to the reports, to their intolerance of Sikhs as such. What he should have said, he gave an okay answer, but what he should have said is something much more along the lines of, oh yeah, I would hang them if they're found guilty, which would shock the audience, because all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're outflanking me on this? That's scary. And I wouldn't say anything to them, because filthy and revolting and malicious as those crimes are, they are not attributable to political decisions. All of the other ones are. It's very important that people are drawing attention to the fact that there is a difference between a consequence of avoidable policy making. What is the first line of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech? The supreme duty of the government is to be on guard against preventable evils. Not all evils. Government can't, change human nature. And if we already have indigenous people in this country, which we obviously do still, thankfully, they're occasionally going to commit awful crimes. When they do, you can hang them if they're really, really as bad as that, if indeed these men are found guilty. But there's no reason to import more. And at that point seems to be missed.
Yeah, there was the same point was made by Nazir Asfal, the former worked for the Crown Prosecution Service, didn't he?
I think so, yeah.
And he shared the video of a teenager guy who worked in a daycare and allegedly molested one of the children, and was saying, oh, I noticed that nobody's making noise about this because the perpetrators aren't Pakistani. And it's just like, yeah, if he's guilty, hang him. And if we recognize that his actions are reprehensible, maybe we shouldn't victimize our women and girls further by importing more of those men who are more likely by a factor of 20 to commit those reprehensible actions from the likes of Afghanistan, Eritrea, and Pakistan, Nazir. But instead, you are only making noise about this because you think, and as the likes of Fraser Nelson and probably Michael Gove, etc., think, or I'm an immigrant, or my wife or my girlfriend's an immigrant, and they're good things. Therefore, every Somali pirate and Pakistani child molester and African gangster must also be a good thing. And this is the same thing that Kemi Badenoch did in her maiden speech, curiously written by Fraser Nelson, apparently.
Yeah, really?
Yeah,
really?
yeah. That was revealed in New Statesman by Will Lloyd.
She seems to be very well liked by Scots. I don't quite understand it.
There is a strange fixation.
Andrew Neil quite likes her, Gove likes her, and Nelson likes her.
Ferguson as well.
Of course,
he said to me at ARC that white men like you and me are yesterday's news, and it takes a person of immigrant stock to make the case for integration to all the immigrants in the country.
Yes.
I would suggest that if they don't like it, they can leave, said. Hey, apparently that makes me far right. But she, in her maiden speech, she started out with, as a first-generation immigrant. And it's like, yes, just because you seem to be a nice person, and I think she's a terrible politician, but just because you seem to be a nice person doesn't mean everyone from the Horn of Africa needs to be here.
Correct. Do you see the possibility of any kind of detente between what we might call Boomercons and Zoomacons? Before, I think on Nick Dixon's podcast, this is a point I've made I'll try and make it as brief as possible. Both Zoomer conservatives and Boomer conservatives have, would you believe, conservative intuitions. The difference is that our conservative intuitions, by virtue of our upbringing, are more directed towards people, and Boomer conservative intuitions, given that they grew up in a country in which they could take the people for granted as just a kind of natural fact on the ground, they're more interested, their conservative intuitions tend to be more directed at institutions. And so a really good example of this is when Jacob Rees-Mogg was asked by Stephen Edgington, Jacob, the fact that the rape gangs happen not proof that multiculturalism has failed, or that diversity has failed, or that mass immigration has failed, or something like that? And Jacob Rees-Mogg said no, because they were prosecuted. And his whole argument was that the thing that guarantees Britishness, the majorly important thing that guarantees Britishness is institutional, namely the rule of law. So if they are prosecuted, that shows that the system is working as it should. What Edgington should have said in response to that, and I've said this to him afterwards, and he's like, yeah, I should have said that. He should have said, okay, fine. If we were to have a Muslim supermajority in this country, and they were to change the law, if the law guarantees Britishness, to Sharia, would that also be just as British? It goes to show that institutions and demographics are obviously very closely related to each other, but they are dislodged and what would be the word? They're dislocated in the minds of boomers because they weren't really thinking much about demographics, whereas we have to. So we grew up realizing that the demographic composition of an institution or a football team or whatever it might be is much more determinative than what the rules say, what the Constitution says. the kind of these sorts of procedural concerns that animate boomer conservatives like Jacob Rees-Mogg, instead of absorbing the lessons that Zoomers like you and I are trying to impart to this quite cloistered, fortunate generation, they seem to be keeping us at a distance. You have people who do understand it, like our mutual friend and associate James Orr, who lives closer to he keeps his ear closer to Zoomer conversations at Cambridge. He interacts with us. He knows our concerns much better. And whenever he tries to act as an emissary for these concerns to older generations, he gets these vicious hit pieces by people like Lord Charles Moore, who I had on the forge the other day, a very lovely man, but he was attacking James Orr in the Telegraph the other day for even giving us a hearing. Is there a possibility of détente?
No, I think the perfect, and people should watch your debate between Will Clues and Charles Moore. The perfect moment that summed up why the détente can't happen is when you pointed out, was Enoch Powell right to suggest that we remedy this demographic and cultural catastrophe in the early stages rather than not just allow it to metastasize, but pour even more kindling on the burning bonfire? And he said, no, because it would be uncivilized. And it's like, okay, would it be uncivilized if the English became a minority in their own country and we turned into Lebanon or Lahore or South Africa or any of the other third world backwaters that you find to be barbarous and reprehensible? So the frustration is that even now, in the late stages of their liberalism, they refuse to recognize that they took the demographic givens upon which their high-trust, homogenous, rules-based country rested for granted. You get this with John Cleese as well. John Cleese, a couple of years ago, got in hot water for saying London is no longer an English city, because it turns out it's a third English at best before the Boris wave, right? Constant actually went on Good Morning Britain and defended that position quite well. John Cleese now is constantly ranting and raving about how Reform are a fascist party.
Is he really?
Yeah, go and check his Twitter. He's whining about Donald Trump. He lives in a multi-million-pound house in Bath.
Yeah, of course he does.
With a German Lib Dem MP, of course, who's now promoting more refugees, just nod in our back garden. So this
didn't realize he was still caught in that. That's
the
awful.
boomer obstinance is not going to, and hashtag not all, because NCS listeners are tuned into this thing, but there is a generational character on the conservative right where boomers will conserve the culture, the institutions, the rules of law that are completely deracinated from the people to whom they are most intuitive. And it's because for them, there was always a pre-political we that never needed to be questioned. For us, we've never had one. And now, and this wraps back around to should there be a sort of a hygiene on the right and saying who should be at the table because they're asking uncomfortable questions about identity. Identity politics only rears its ugly head when every single other group is allowed to play identity politics. And so politics becomes a game of competing identities warring over resources. But when the indigenous population or heritage Americans or Englishmen argue, well, we should have an identity of our own to collectively bargain on our behalf because we're being destroyed in our own country, you are told by your own side, no, that's racist, fascist, continue fighting with one hand behind your back. And the young people, as Matt Goodwin actually put in a report for Policy Exchange recently, recognized that while questions of economics were the most salient for the Cold War political generations, questions of identity have been forced upon our generation. And so without settling that question, we aren't going to get anywhere. And it's frustrating that the likes of Spectator, Unheard, Reform UK, as I've now been blacklisted, are refusing to have even that conversation in an orderly fashion and causing it to sequester on areas of the internet, like the wonderful New Culture Forum, that they do not sully themselves to frequent.
Yeah, this is true. And but what is extraordinary is that the incoherence of their worldview is being noticed at such scale that I don't see how they're going to be able to maintain their communication strategy in place. I mean, most of these people, like sooner or later, like if you want to get a sense of what people really care about deep down, most people, even genuine classical liberals who are ultra conceptually consistent about their liberalism and genuinely would say defend the right of a Nazi group to march through a city so long as they don't hurt anyone. Most people have a sacred, untouchable center that is axiomatic in their worldview and which isn't really welcome to being questioned. Even if it is just the enabling conditions of a classical liberal society. Most liberals will accept that there are certain things that need to be in place for a classical liberal society to work and all the rest of it. You get a really good sense of what people's untouchable center is when you point to certain exceptions. And so you get these people who claim to be like virulently opposed to any form of collective identity politics. But if you were to say to them, even someone who's quite like Michael Gove, for instance, if you were to say to him, what's worse, the persecution, this isn't an exact moral parallel, but what is worse, the persecution of Jews in Nazi-occupied Germany, or the presumption on Nazi-occupied Holland, or the presumption on the part of Jews in Nazi-occupied Holland that they had a right to act collectively in concert and defend themselves. That would no one in a million years would believe that Jewish collective self-defense, or even Pakistani collective self-defense, or even Sikh collective self-defense, as we've seen with the rape gangs in Britain, is sort of verboten. But when it comes to white people organizing, in European societies, in America, wherever else it might be, and saying there is clearly a very insidious, systematic attack on us as white people. This is being tolerated. This is being entertained. This enjoys official sanction, institutional sanction. This is in Harvard. This is from the CNN. This is from MSNBC. This is from the BBC.
The Equality Act.
The Equality Act. We have a right to act collectively and defend ourselves, because if we don't, we're just going to be food for people who do act in such a way. Even this continues to be treated as a sort of proto-fascistic, if not fully fascistic attitude. So by people on our side, not by Zach Polanski, although I'm sure he thinks that too.
Yeah, considering he changed his name to sound more Jewish, which is really weird, especially considering he's a co-belligerent with a bunch of anti-Zionist Muslims. There you go.
Very strange.
But actually, Gove is the best example here, and we use him as the example because he was the longest-serving cabinet minister of the last government and did absolutely nothing about it if he wanted to. During the debate that has not still aired, I asked Michael why he gave a cover endorsement to Yoram Hazony's book in the early 2000s, making the explicitly ethno-nationalist case for Zionism, and Yoram would not object to that characterization. And he said that this is the best book to settle the ideological questions of our time. So he advocates...
He said that. The best book to settle the ideological questions of our time.
It's on the front cover.
That's an extraordinary comment.
Yes. And so he supports Israel being an ethno-state for the Jewish people as founded by Ben-Gurion in 1948, because Ben-Gurion wasn't a Bible-believing Jew. He just cared about Jewish ethnic people in the aftermath of the Second World War. But he insists that we, as he said at the dispatch box, must be multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, and diversity is our strength. Why does he hold one standard of collective action and identity that seems to work for the Israelis, but denies that same standard for England? And I think we should have the same standard. And he told me with a straight face, well, it's actually the strength of Israel, and that it's a democracy. So hypothetically, they could elect a non-Jew. Yeah. And I said, would it not prove to be the undoing of Israel that if the demographics got to such a point where the people would elect a non-Jew as either prime minister or president of Israel, that it would cease to be Israel? Because Israel's a Jewish nation, and the only reason they would elect a non-Jew is because there are enough non-Jews in the country who thought, I am no longer represented by a Jew. Conversation moves swiftly on. And this is why I don't think that we're ever going to reach an accord with these people, because they either ignore us or censor us or blacklist us or shut us out, as has been increasingly happening with a lot of young talent on the side. One final example I'll use if I may. Did you see that Reform had spearheaded its student activist network recently?
I did see this, yes.
I'm very glad that they are trying to do a youth recruitment body after someone more competent and energetic proposed one before. We spoke about it on Deprogrammed.
We're talking about Charlie Downs, for people who are not aware.
Yes, and was turned away and told no, probably because he is too outspoken and therefore a liability for people who want to keep messaging on a very tight leash. If you see the lineup in their stead, because they didn't trust young talent who are very capable and now doing good work at Restore Britain, it looks less like the presumptive party of government and more like a regional branch retreat for Carphone Warehouse.
I knew something amusing was coming, and you didn't disappoint.
It's like the reason MAGA won young people was because it was energetic, it was upwardly mobile, it was the cruel kids table, as that transgender identifying person wrote in New York Magazine. So get some attractive, competent, outspoken people with a bit of energy to front your party if you want to win young people over. But doing that requires you trust young people, you cultivate young talent, and you address their concerns, as the likes of James Orr has done, and then he gets hit pieces for being even proximate to us from the boomer old guard who want to draw up the drawbridge.
Yeah, no, this seems very much to be the case. I would just add one final thought on poor Michael Gove.
He deserves it.
So yes, if you isolate the state of exception you isolate what really animates people fundamentally. Everyone, like, I don't care how much of a free speech absolutist you claim to be, everyone has their red line at which they go, not necessarily about we want to throw this person to prison, not necessarily that, but everyone has their red line beyond which they believe that no conversation is worth having. Everyone thinks this, like, no one thinks that, like, for example, the people at Spiked who are constantly attacking us, they are all, understandably, they don't think that, oh, well, Neville Chamberlain should have just tried to have more conversations with Hitler. Like, let's try out the marketplace of ideas. They have an understanding that occasionally realism just kicks in, whether it's in geopolitics or in domestic politics. That logic they don't seem to be able to incorporate that logic into a domestic setting where it isn't worth debating people who believe that Charlie Kirk deserved to be killed.
Yes.
It isn't worth debating. So we all have our red lines. It's a question of where they are. And it's only then that you really get a sense of what animates people. On the nationalism point again, it's not just that they are sort of multi-culti civnats in Britain and sort of thoroughgoing blood-based ethnats in Israel if it's Michael Gove, or in Bengal if it's Ash Sarkar, Palestine if it's Owen Jones or Mehdi Hassan or whatever it is. It's that they view anything less than blood-based thoroughgoing ethno-nationalism in those territories, not just as not as good as any alternative, but as effectively genocide. Meanwhile, if you type in white genocide theory, and you use that sort of language to describe mass immigration, critical mass immigration into Western countries, it's laughed off as a conspiracy theory.
The best example of this was in the last week, which I'm sure you enjoyed, Dinesh D'Souza, his crash out. So Tyler Oliveira, who did a not even insulting mini documentary about a turd-throwing Diwali festival in a rural Indian village, which then caused him to be doxxed, harassed, receive death threats from thousands of Indians. When Tyler said, I'm not going to put it out, it isn't worth the threats, and then eventually did put it out, Dinesh D'Souza responded saying, all these poop throwers are going to take over. Bear in mind, Dinesh D'Souza, who, I used to watch as part of the Young American Foundation tours back when we were all on the left, the real racist stage of the rhetoric. In the 90s, he wrote a book called The End of Racism that had to be retracted because he had insulted the VDare guys and...
He lied about the paleocons.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's funny. We have to be all colorblind, meritocratic, anti-identity politics, Reagan, Bill Buckley liberals, if you're a conservative. But as the VDare guys have said, everyone's an ethno-nationalist for somewhere. And it turns out, as soon as India's insulted, yet again, dives in like a poo, who ironically was a better stereotype to have than,
Yeah, you should
poo-throwing scandal.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the state of exception kicks in, and it's just a question of isolating it. But I do like to think that despite all of the institutional resistance that we are facing at the moment, we do have energy on our side.
We're building our own.
Determination on our side, and we have logical coherence on our side, which is why we're not being invited to debate. They invite the blue-haired girl to take the microphone because they're confident that they can destroy her. But they're rather less interested in taking on intelligent criticism to their right. There's only so long that they're going to be able to get away with that.
Are you implying I might have won that set 2 with Go that still hasn't?
I'd need to see it. And I don't think we're going to. But maybe that reveals itself.
People can ask if they want to see it. Just let the spectator know.
It's been good, Connor.
Pleasure.
Been good.
As always.
Thank you for watching, and we shall see you on the next.